Before dawn broke over Ouagadougou, 17 doors were forced open at once. What seemed like ordinary aid offices and technology hubs were revealed to be hidden chambers of surveillance. Within hours, over 2 million profiles of Burkinabe citizens were seized. Names, voices, even the fingerprints of a nation caught in secret servers. It was not a quiet discovery. It was a rupture, a wound torn open in the digital flesh of Africa. What is sovereignty if the lifeblood of governance, information, is siphoned abroad? This is not about borders drawn in red ink on colonial maps. This is about borders made of fiber cables, satellites, and invisible codes. Into this storm stepped Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a young soldier who has become a symbol larger than himself. He did not merely order a raid. He lit a fire that may yet spread across the continent. Do not look away. What comes next may change how Africa defines freedom. Subscribe and walk with us. And so, from that morning of shattered locks and seized servers, the question rises: is this the beginning of a continental revolution, or only a fleeting spark that will be smothered by pressure? Stay, for the story is only beginning. In the gray silence before sunrise, Ouagadougou became the stage for a military choreography unlike anything West Africa had seen before. At precisely 5 o'clock in the morning, orders were signed and sealed. By 7, security units spread across the capital like veins pulsing with resolve. 17 targets, 17 doors, 17 facades of legitimacy were about to be unmasked. They bore names that suggested charity, development, progress. Behind those facades, however, lay the circuitry of control, the silent architecture of an empire that fed not its hosts but unseen masters abroad. The first site raided stood on the city's eastern edge, a glass-paneled office with banners promoting digital agriculture innovation. Neighbors thought of it as a non-governmental organization helping farmers. Yet as troops moved through the building, room by room, the truth emerged. Servers stacked like hidden coffins, routers encrypted beyond local comprehension, data cables snaking into the ground before vanishing into foreign channels. Investigators later traced their signals to Herzliya in Israel. The image of agriculture was a mask. The reality was interception, duplication, filtration. 2 blocks from the Ministry of Education, another facility hid its secret beneath rusting warehouse doors. Here, troops found an archive of nearly 2 million digital profiles of Burkinabe citizens. They were not just lists of names. Each record bore fingerprints, biometric scans, residential addresses, call histories stretching back more than 8 years. It was a mirror of a nation, reduced to code, harvested without consent, and channeled into the hands of others. In that moment, it became clear that privacy was not merely violated. It had been sold, repackaged, and transported overseas. As the morning advanced, one raid followed another. 6 facilities carried the appearance of humanitarian offices, education partnerships, or telecom support projects. Inside, however, lay equipment more familiar to intelligence services than to aid workers: satellite transmission nodes, racks of hard drives, secure routers programmed with foreign encryption protocols. Officials reported maps of mineral reserves with coordinates for gold and manganese deposits, drawn with military precision. Later cross-checks revealed identical files stored in Tel Aviv. It was as if the soil itself, the veins of Burkina Faso, had been mapped not for development, but for extraction. By 8:45, the city was sealed in silence. 17 sites secured. Troops removed stacks of equipment in unmarked trucks, their presence captured by citizens' phones and circulated across social media within minutes. Helicopters hovered above government districts. Eyewitnesses described black vehicles stationed discreetly outside compounds, soldiers moving in synchrony, operations executed with surgical precision. And still, the streets echoed not with gunfire, but with awe, for no civilian casualties were reported, no indiscriminate violence occurred. It was as if the state had peeled back a curtain and shown its people the hidden stage behind the official theater. The evidence gathered spoke louder than declarations. Among the confiscated material were intercepted cabinet discussions, stored in encrypted files, satellite imagery aligned with foreign dossiers, telecom backbones linked by fiber to offshore relay stations. Colonel Isufu Zongo, the military spokesperson, later declared, "What we discovered was not development assistance. It was systematic surveillance." His words cut through the silence like a blade, stripping away the comfortable narrative of partnerships and aid, exposing instead a network woven into the arteries of governance. For analysts, the sophistication of the operation left little doubt. Encryption protocols, data duplication methods, concealed transmission routes. These were not isolated mistakes or rogue contractors. This was coordination, a structured system that had been embedded for over a decade. Experts described it as an empire without soldiers, a colony built not with forts and flags, but with routers and satellites. A digital occupation that did not march with boots, but with algorithms. International media hesitated at first. Western networks carried no breaking coverage, leaving African outlets to fill the void with rolling updates. Yet on social platforms, the story ignited. Hashtags began trending by midday. Africa is not for sale. Our data, our choice. Young citizens, holding only their phones, amplified what their televisions refused to show. In marketplaces, whispers turned to open discussions. What had seemed like aid now looked like espionage. What had been introduced as progress was recast as betrayal. For the Burkinabe people, the discovery was not only shocking, but clarifying. In one morning, a hidden enemy was revealed. Not an army at the border, but a network in their networks. Eyes in their cameras, ears in their calls. The soil beneath them was mapped from afar, their voices stored abroad, their decisions monitored in silence. The dawn raid stripped illusions bare and left only questions of dignity and defense. But as the dust settled in Ouagadougou, one truth became unavoidable. This was not the climax of the story. It was only its first act, for what follows a revelation of such scale is never quiet acceptance. It is reaction, from citizens, from neighbors, from the world beyond. And that reaction would prove as fierce as the raid itself. The morning raids were shocking, but it was the hours that followed which transformed a local operation into a continental drama. In Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped before cameras, his words echoing far beyond the walls of the presidential palace. "Africa is no longer your laboratory. We are not your test subjects. And this continent will no longer be your blind spot." With that declaration, a young officer turned the discovery of hidden servers into the rallying cry of a generation. The impact was immediate. Markets buzzed with outrage. Radio stations broadcast citizen testimonies, and graffiti began to bloom on city walls like wildflowers after a storm. Our data, our choice. Africa is not for sale. Digital sovereignty is national sovereignty. Each slogan carried the rhythm of defiance, each word painted not in ink, but in the fire of betrayal. Across Ouagadougou, ordinary people who once saw technology as distant or abstract now saw it as a battlefield of dignity. Neighboring capitals did not remain still. In Bamako, Malian authorities shut down 3 firms suspected of channeling data abroad. In Niamey, officials neutralized a surveillance compound hidden inside an embassy. In Conakry, Guinea froze military imports linked to Israeli suppliers. In Lomé, Togo suspended telecom contracts pending emergency audits. The ripples of Burkina Faso's raid were no longer just ripples. They were waves striking every shore of West Africa. For decades, governments had spoken primarily about aid packages and loans. Now, they called each other to discuss retaliation, defense, sovereignty. Crowds filled the streets. In Bamako, students lifted banners declaring, "Africa is not for sale." In Conakry, mothers marched peacefully with placards. Digital sovereignty is national sovereignty. In Ouagadougou itself, young activists painted murals of chains breaking into sparks of light. This was not anger alone. It was pride wrapped in resistance. A belief that Africa need not bow to invisible masters who harvested its wealth through cables and code. The response reached a crescendo 2 days later when 6 heads of state, from Mali, Guinea, Niger, Togo, Ghana, and Benin, convened in Ouagadougou for a closed-door summit. The symbolism was as powerful as the substance. Around the table lay folders containing the confiscated documents, evidence of exploitation that united them not as aid recipients, but as guardians of sovereignty. Traore presented a draft framework, the Continental Digital Sovereignty Doctrine. Its pillars were clear: no foreign telecom investment without full transparency of infrastructure. All citizen data to remain physically stored within Africa. Any undeclared intelligence activity to result in immediate expulsion and removal of diplomatic cover. And above all, an attack on one nation's digital sovereignty would be treated as an attack on all. Observers compared the moment to the Monroe Doctrine of 19th century America, but written now in African voices for the digital age. Leaders debated not in whispers but with urgency. Ghana's president demanded oversight by engineers and civil society rather than politicians. Togo's delegation insisted the framework must be binding, not symbolic. And by the summit's end, each leader signed a declaration recognizing digital sovereignty as a continental priority. What began as a dawn raid in Burkina Faso had already become the seed of a Pan-African doctrine. Internationally, the contrast in reaction was stark. Western governments issued cautious statements. Paris and London warned of destabilization. Washington think tanks labeled the doctrine radical. Yet African streets told another story, one of unity and determination. Al Jazeera described the exposure as the unveiling of a hidden empire. China's Global Times called it a turning point in Africa's technological independence. Russian outlets framed it as proof of Western hypocrisy. For the first time in decades, Africa was not merely reacting to external narratives. It was shaping one. Social media amplified this divergence. Hashtags like Africa is not for sale, our data, our choice, and digital sovereignty trended across the continent. Young Africans wrote manifestos online, linking digital sovereignty to independence movements of the past. Community radio programs debated what sovereignty meant in the age of cloud computing. The story had left the realm of politicians and entered the hearts of ordinary citizens. It was no longer about the 2 million profiles alone. It was about dignity, autonomy, the right to exist unmonitored. And yet, within this rising chorus lay a question more profound than any headline. Could this unity last? Could the heat of outrage be channeled into the endurance of policy? Could the chants of the street become the architecture of law? The raid had revealed the enemy and sparked the flame. But revolutions are not won in a single morning. They are carried forward in patience, in resilience, in the unyielding defense of principle. And beyond Africa's borders, forces were already moving to test whether this fire would be sustained or extinguished. The morning raids in Ouagadougou had seized more than hardware. They had seized the imagination of a people long told that sovereignty was a matter of borders and flags. In the days that followed, Burkinabe citizens spoke of a new kind of independence, one woven not from cloth banners, but from servers, firewalls, and the guarded flow of information. The civil consequences were felt first in households, then in markets, then across the very rhythm of national life. In the short term, relief and resolve. Find the atmosphere. Relief, because the hidden theft of data had been unmasked before it could spiral further. Resolve, because the nation now faced the arduous task of securing its digital house. Community meetings buzzed with discussions once reserved for specialists. Where should data be stored? Who can be trusted to manage it? What laws must be written to protect it? In Ouagadougou's markets, vendors spoke as if encryption were as vital as grain, as if sovereignty had found a new vocabulary in ordinary conversations. National agencies moved swiftly. Emergency decrees required foreign companies to submit their infrastructure for inspection. Servers discovered abroad were flagged for legal review. Contracts were frozen until transparency could be guaranteed. These measures sent ripples through the economy. Multinational firms reliant on opaque systems hesitated or withdrew, while smaller African startups, once sidelined, stepped forward. Within months, the cost of internet services began to fall, while service speed doubled. A sign that sovereignty, far from being abstract, could improve daily life. Politically, the impact was seismic. The government, once accused of fragility, now wore the armor of decisiveness. For the first time in years, citizens spoke with admiration rather than cynicism about the state's capacity to defend them. The army, often viewed as distant or authoritarian, was reimagined as protector not only of borders but of identity. Civil society movements that had campaigned for years on privacy issues suddenly found their voices amplified. What had once been whispers of concern were now choruses demanding accountability. Yet the consequences stretched further than optimism. The exposure of espionage under the guise of aid bred suspicion towards genuine partnerships. NGOs found themselves challenged by communities once welcoming. The question on everyone's lips was simple. If aid can be a mask, how do we distinguish a gift from a chain? Trust, and that delicate fabric of international cooperation, it was torn, and repairing it would take more than promises. It would require proof, transparency, and respect. For Captain Traoré, this moment became more than a military operation. It became the seed of what many began to call the Ibrahim Traoré legacy. The assertion that sovereignty must be defended not only on the battlefield, but in the invisible realm of data. His speeches, broadcast across the continent, framed the raids not as a Burkinabe story, but as an African one. When your data is stored abroad, your freedom is stored abroad, he declared. The words resonated because they revealed a truth citizens had long sensed but could not articulate. Dependence in the digital age is dependence all the same. Opposition politicians tried to harness the wave of sentiment, some accusing the government of overreaching, others demanding stronger reforms. Yet few dared to criticize the operation itself, for it had captured public imagination too deeply. Instead, the debate centered on what came next. Should Burkina Faso lead the drafting of regional laws, or should it wait for continental frameworks? Should it prioritize partnerships with powers like China, India, or Russia, or attempt to build indigenous capacity first? Each question revealed both opportunity and risk, a crossroads that demanded wisdom as much as passion. The international spotlight sharpened these dilemmas. Western capitals warned against isolationist policies, painting sovereignty as radical. Yet in African streets, the very word sovereignty gained new life. University lectures framed it as a second independence. Student unions discussed firewalls alongside freedom. Civil society painted murals of chains made not of iron, but of cables, broken by young hands reaching upward. The symbolism mattered because it turned technical debates into cultural memory. Still, sovereignty on paper is fragile without the means to enforce it. Challenges loomed large. Building secure data centers required expertise and funding. Training local engineers demanded long-term investment. Oversight councils risked falling into bureaucracy or corruption if not designed with care. The government faced the paradox of every revolution: how to transform fire into foundation, how to ensure that momentum did not fade into nostalgia. In this fragile balance lay the future of Burkina Faso. Would the discovery of 2 million stolen profiles mark only a passing scandal, or would it inaugurate a new era of governance? Would citizens' pride be matched by practical capacity? Would partners respect Africa's insistence on dignity, or would they merely rebrand their exploitation in subtler terms? These were not questions confined to the capital. They were debated in villages, campuses, markets, and ministries. They defined not just the months after the raids, but the political trajectory of the nation itself. For in the end, sovereignty is not a proclamation. It is a practice, defended daily, enforced through vigilance, lived in the dignity of every citizen. Yet the resonance of this struggle was never meant to remain within Burkina Faso alone. Its echoes reached across borders, into the chambers of regional and global diplomacy. The shockwaves of Operation Clear Sight did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. Within days, Africa's digital rebellion became the subject of hurried calls, guarded statements, and clashing headlines in capitals across the world. What had begun as a dawn raid on 17 compounds in Ouagadougou evolved into a diplomatic standoff, one that revealed the fault lines of global power in the digital age. The most striking exchange occurred within 24 hours of the raids. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu phoned Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Official sources reported that the conversation lasted barely 12 minutes. Netanyahu insisted that Israel's activities in Africa were developmental, not espionage. He warned that Burkina Faso risked destabilizing West Africa by politicizing technology. Traoré's response was firm, almost defiant. "There is no misunderstanding when you spy on us. That is not development. That is occupation." The call ended without resolution, and the silence that followed was louder than any speech. In Paris, newspapers branded Traoré authoritarian. London opinion pieces labeled him destabilizing. In Washington, think tanks described him as radical. Yet these portrayals failed to dampen the wave building across Africa. In Bamako, students chanted, "Freka is not for sale." In Conakry, mothers marched under banners declaring, "Digital sovereignty is national sovereignty." Social media platforms overflowed with hashtags like "Our Data, Our Choice," uniting voices from Lagos to Nairobi. For once, Africa was not echoing the world. The world was echoing Africa. Diplomatic responses revealed deep divides. The European Union warned that sanctions could follow if African nations violated investment norms. France suspended certain military training programs, citing erosion of trust. Meanwhile, delegations from China, India, and Russia moved swiftly. Beijing proposed laying fiber optic backbones under full African ownership. Delhi pledged to build continental data centers. Moscow offered cybersecurity expertise, promising that all oversight would remain African. For the first time in decades, Africa was courted not as a passive recipient of aid, but as a partner capable of setting conditions. At the African Union, debates turned into declarations. Nigeria's representative thundered, "If one nation is spied on, all of us are spied on." If one loses sovereignty, all of us lose. The chamber erupted in applause. Observers noted the symbolism. This was Africa speaking with one voice, rejecting the fragmentation that had so often weakened its bargaining power. Across the continent, digital sovereignty was no longer a technical policy. It was becoming a principle as sacred as territorial independence. For Captain Traoré, the moment embodied more than tactical victory. It revealed the contours of a future many began to call the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050, a long horizon where Africa would not only secure its borders of soil, but its borders of code. His stance placed him at the heart of a geopolitical struggle, praised in African streets, criticized in Western editorials, but undeniably central to the debate over 21st century sovereignty. Yet questions remained. Would Africa's partners respect this new doctrine, or simply disguise old habits under fresh contracts? Would international pressure fracture the unity forged in Ouagadougou, or would it strengthen it into a lasting alliance? The answers would determine not only Burkina Faso's place in history, but the continent's trajectory toward its digital future. The dust of Operation Clear Sight has settled, yet its echoes continue to shape the path before Burkina Faso and its neighbors. The question is no longer whether hidden espionage existed. The servers, the maps, and the millions of stolen profiles have answered that. The question now is whether Africa can turn outrage into order, revelation into resilience, and crisis into construction. The road ahead is neither simple nor singular. It offers three possible directions, each demanding courage and clarity. In the first scenario, the continent embraces the momentum. Data centers rise not as foreign outposts, but as African fortresses. Local engineers, trained and empowered, design firewalls that guard not only information, but identity. Internet services become faster, cheaper, and more reliable, as sovereignty translates into tangible progress for citizens. African startups, long overshadowed, grow into regional champions. This path is ambitious, but it holds the promise of dignity transformed into development. The second scenario is one of stagnation. Laws are passed, but poorly enforced. Oversight councils drown in bureaucracy or corruption. International partners exploit loopholes, rebranding old practices under new names. Citizens, once energized, grow disillusioned as promises fade into slogans. In this vision, digital sovereignty risks becoming a banner waved but not defended, a seed sown but never nurtured into harvest. The third scenario is darker still. External pressure intensifies. Sanctions, political isolation, economic withdrawal. Divisions among African states widen, as some bow to international demands, while others resist. The unity forged in Ouagadougou fractures under the weight of competing interests. In this version of the future, sovereignty remains a dream deferred, constantly invoked, but never secured. Which of these paths will Africa walk? The answer lies in choices made not only by leaders, but by citizens. For sovereignty is not decreed from podiums alone. It is lived in daily vigilance, in the insistence that dignity cannot be outsourced, in the refusal to accept exploitation hidden behind aid. It is a seed planted in the soil of resilience, watered by sacrifice, and harvested in the seasons of collective resolve. As Captain Ibrahim Traoré has reminded his people, sovereignty is not a gift to be requested, but a right to be defended. The dawn raid of Ouagadougou has shown that even a small nation can lift the veil on empires that thrive in silence. But revelation is not the same as transformation. The future will depend on whether Africa can build structures sturdy enough to outlast outrage, and unity strong enough to withstand pressure. For the continent, the stakes are existential. If Africa can defend its digital frontiers, it may redefine independence for the 21st century, not in trenches or treaties, but in servers, satellites, and sovereign code. If it cannot, then the age-old story of exploitation will simply adapt to new tools, and history will record another lost opportunity. And so, the road ahead is clear only in its uncertainty, a crossroads where destiny will be chosen not in silence, but in strength. From the silence of dawn raids to the thunder of continental debate, Operation Clear Sight has revealed a truth long buried beneath the language of aid and partnership. Sovereignty in the 21st century is no longer only about land and borders. It is about cables, satellites, and the invisible architecture of data. And in this new battlefield, Burkina Faso has stood as the unlikely torchbearer, guided by Captain Ibrahim Traoré. For citizens of Ouagadougou, the discovery of 2 million stolen profiles was more than a scandal. It was a mirror held up to a continent. It showed how dependence in technology can be as suffocating as dependence in trade, how foreign hands can reach not only for gold in the soil, but for fingerprints on the screens. Yet it also revealed something more powerful: the will of a people to reclaim what had been quietly taken. Outrage became resolve, resolve became pride, and pride became a vision. That vision now stretches far beyond the borders of one landlocked nation. It is what many have begun to call the Ibrahim Traoré legacy, the belief that Africa can define its own destiny in the digital age. His defiance against exploitation, his insistence that surveillance is occupation, has ignited a wider movement. Universities debate digital independence. Activists paint sovereignty on city walls. Leaders draft frameworks once unthinkable. The legacy is not written in monuments but in firewalls, not carved in stone, but coded in resilience. And within this legacy lies a horizon yet to be reached, the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050. It is a vision of an Africa where servers hum under African skies, where citizens' data is guarded by their own laws, where sovereignty is not conditional, but complete. It is a dream still fragile, tested by sanctions, threatened by division, yet alive because millions believe it possible. The question now is whether this moment will be remembered as a spark that faded or as the dawn of a revolution that endured. Will the Ibrahim Traoré legacy become a pillar of governance, And will the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050 shape the future of a continent? The answer rests not in the hands of a single captain, but in the resolve of an entire people. If this story speaks to your sense of justice, do not let it pass in silence. Subscribe, share, and let your voice be part of Africa's rising chorus.